Did you know that there is actually an official way to make Neapolitan pizza? I did a video on this just recently, but today we're gonna make pizza by the book. Let's make some pizza. I'm going to rely on 3 sources of information for changing up my technique. Today's the first time I've done it, so you're going to discover how this goes with me. I've got the Disciplinare. I did another video on this, and I'll point you to that in the comments. I'm also going to be using a book that we're going to talk a lot about in the near future, and this is called La Pizza Napolitana, and this is more than a scientific guide. It really tries to blend science and art in pizza making and following the traditional Neapolitan style pizza. This book is amazing. I was lucky to get my hands on it, but there's a link to this on my website and in the comments below if you want to buy it. It's kind of expensive in the United States. I was able to get a copy from Italy in Italian. It's fantastic. And finally, there's another video that I'll link you to by Enzo Coccia. There are a few variations in his presentation from the actual official guide. So I'm going to lean towards the official guide on this. Let's start with the ingredients. There are only 4 ingredients allowed. So we've got our flour, our water, our salt, and our yeast. And the proportions are important. So we've got 1 liter of water. I've got 1,650 grams of flour. I've got 50 grams of salt. And I've got 1 gram of yeast. If you're using fresh yeast, you want to use 3 grams of yeast for the basic recipe. The more flour you use, proportionally, the less yeast you're going to use. This recipe actually starts with the water. So we're going to pour the water in. That's 1 liter of water. It's essentially room temperature. Temperatures are very important for this formula. And we're going to blend in the salt. I want to get this well blended before I do my next step, which is putting in the yeast. One point of caution that you want to follow is with the yeast. You don't want the yeast and the salt to be mixing together in the water for more than 5 minutes on their own, because you can reduce the effectiveness of the yeast. If you do it correctly, the salt actually enhances the effectiveness of the yeast. This way of putting the flour in is called the waterfall method, or a cascata. It helps thoroughly mix the flour into the mixture so you don't end up with something that's kind of clumpy. And that's what you want to do. You want to get nice and smooth, and then you throw in your next batch of flour. According to the regulation of the AVPN, you would actually be using a mixer for this, a mechanical mixer. You have to be really careful with the mechanical mixers because they heat up and they'll actually introduce a little too much heat into the dough. But the regulation calls for using a mechanical mixer, which is a much more precise method. So my goal right now is to mix this so that all the flour is consumed into the mixture. There's no more flour essentially left in the bowl. And then we're gonna work it on the table. As we do this, we're mixing air into the flour dough mixture. I wouldn't quite call it dough yet, but we're mixing in that air. That's gonna be useful for us. So we're kind of taking it from the bottom, and then we're pushing it in as we get it. This is almost ready to take out of the bowl and to work on the table. At this point, you can see that the dough is irregular and sticky. That's not what we want. We're gonna try to get this as smooth as possible, and it should be less sticky when we're done. So we're gonna keep on going. So the movements of making the dough do more than just mix the dough together. We're folding air into the dough, and the energy that we put into it by sort of smashing it down with our hands actually helps form the gluten chains. It creates the chemical reaction that we're looking for that's going to make this smooth, and it's going to make it a nice pizza dough. You can already see it's starting to smooth out. Now, that's just on this side. As I work this, it's going to get smoother and smoother. I learned this punching method from a little old lady in Bitonto, and I didn't really think much of it until I saw Enzo Coccia, who is probably the foremost expert on Neapolitan pizza in the world, use the exact same method. It was good for my heart. Signora Lovascia, if you can hear me, we all miss you. My mother-in-law used the same method, and later her sons, her kids, they kind of made fun of her for it, but you know what? They ate her food. We're not quite there yet, but you can see that we're getting smoother and smoother as we go. Dough is nice and smooth. I'm gonna take my bowl and put it back in here, and I'm gonna cover it with some wet dish rags, and I'm gonna let this grow for about 8 hours. It's only been about 5 hours, but we have to take into account the fact that this house, which is temperature controlled, is a little bit warmer than the specification for 8 hours. We'll still get more than 8 hours of total proofing time. I'm going to go ahead and cut into dough balls, and after that, we'll let it continue to grow for about another 3.5 hours. Following the recipe exactly, we've got 6 grams of grated cheese, 90 grams of mozzarella, 70 grams of tomatoes, and a few basil leaves. We'll add the olive oil in later. As you can tell from the wrapper on the oven, the party's over, so I thought it was important to put a wrapper on what we just did and what we did differently on our Neapolitan pizza. Normally, I make a Polish, which means the night before I'm mixing part of the flour, part of the water, and the yeast, letting it sit in the refrigerator overnight, and then the next day mixing in additional flour, mixing in the salt, letting it rise as such for a shorter period of time. The Neapolitan pizza requires the direct method, which is what I followed. I mixed all 4 ingredients, water, salt, flour, and yeast together in one time, and then I let that sit for a while. Then I cut the dough into balls, and then I let those balls raise for a while on their own. I also did not use any honey to activate the yeast. That's really the only ingrediential difference in the dough that I made for the Neapolitan pizzas. The second thing I did differently was with the way I sauced and topped the pizza. Yesterday, when I was making the Neapolitan pizza, I put the tomatoes directly on the pizza. I added the basil on top of that, the Parmesan on top of that, and the mozzarella. And the ingredients were a little bit less than I'm used to using. Normally, I mix that together beforehand, except for the mozzarella, and add to the pizza. Also, I put the olive oil in the sauce normally, but this time I followed the recipe and I put the olive oil on top in that circular motion or that spiral motion as required by the regulation or the disciplinare. The cooking time was about the same. I did cook it in a wood-fired oven as required, but that's my normal methodology. So what were the results? Well, here's what the pizza looked like. And you can see that it was soft and crunchy. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to actually film someone eating that pizza because it disappeared very quickly. So in the end, was it worth it? Is it worth it to follow strictly the disciplinare? I really like my pizzas that I make normally, but following the disciplinare, I learned a lot. And not only that, the pizzas were phenomenal. I think probably the best I've ever made. By sticking strictly to the Neapolitan method, we got a different taste to the pizza. It tasted more like Italy to me. The olive oil really came through, as did the other ingredients. The flavors really struck through. That's what everybody who tried it said. Unfortunately, I only got to eat one piece because it was so popular that everybody at the party wanted some. Thanks again for watching. Hit that thumbs up. Please subscribe and give us your comments below. I love to respond to comments. Thanks very much, and we'll see you soon.